I'm Rebecca Harrison, founder and creative director of Flighty Felon Games, and this is Freeride, a personality test that plays like an action RPG. But what does that really mean? So we don't use any AI or procedural narrative. We just watch the way the player naturally interacts with the RPG's mechanics. And so, for example, we have one metric, which is curiosity/safe. And that is basically how many rooms does the player enter compared to the average. Another example is taking the ratio of weapons to non-weapons in the inventory, as well as the number of demons vanquished. And we use a little mathematical equation to turn that into your assertive/passive score. Then at the very end of a playthrough, along with several other statistics, we will create a personality outcome for the player. And that might be a companion, or you might be a betrayer, or a bully, or a friend, or a hero, depending on the actions you took unconsciously while playing. But that's not where it ends, because Freeride is ultimately a game about metamorphosis, where you can be who you want to be. And so after each playthrough, because of your decisions, you've only seen a fraction of the full story because much of it is happening simultaneously. And sub-branches are even only visible to certain playstyles, such as like serious explorers or combat seekers will see stuff that those who take the guided paths will never see. But this is all pretty abstract. So how does this work in practice? Let's use 3 examples from our playtests. Kate, Julian, and Alex. I showed them the game, written out in its entirety, as an interactive PowerPoint, and this is their results from Act 2, which has 4 possible solutions along with every other act. The guided, alternate guided, exploratory, and combat routes. At the beginning of this act, you are betrayed by a character, Lepida, and one character, Kono, wants to prove her innocence, while the other, Albion, wants to prove her guilty. In the paper playtest, Alex and Kate both went with Kono. Each guided path really lets you get to know and care for 1 or 2 of the main cast. It also poses a moral dilemma to the player, but it never asks them point blank how to approach it. Instead, a player will naturally reveal their decision by the sort of unconscious choices they make. So for example, as Kate and Alex were following Kono, they found that she was being stalked by another character, Solo, who was actually responsible for her death and now feels guilty about this and feels that it's his need to get her forgiveness before he can pass into the afterlife. As they were going down this path, fighting demons, collecting objects, and just interacting with the RPG, Kate was very uninterested in listening to what Solo had to say and so stuck with Kono, whereas Alex actually followed Solo to find out more about the situation. And because of this, when faced with the final confrontation between the 2 characters, Alex was more neutral, whereas Kate sided 100% with Kono. And this vastly changed the outcome of the story. Meanwhile, Julian took an entirely different path. He followed with Albion trying to prove that Lepida was guilty, but he diverged from it halfway when he started encountering demons to fight. So he ended up finding the secret boss of the area and actually going down a completely different story branch altogether from Kate and Alex. Because if you take the guided paths, that will take you to Act 3. But if you complete one of the exploratory or combat routes in Act 2, it will take you to Act 4B, which is an entirely different thing. And these other routes are never actually mentioned. They're just there. And so players who are naturally inclined to explore or fight will find them. And as you play the game, which loops seamlessly at the end and invites you to try different play styles, you will start to know more and more about the narrative, and you'll be inclined to explore more or fight more as you become more comfortable with the game. The actual way you interact with the world is through this telekinesis mechanic, which is very open-ended. So, for example, you might pick up an ice cream cone in the ice cream shop, and you can use that as a projectile. You can fight with that ice cream cone, or you can use it as a shield. You can trade it in for gold or other items. You can use it to distract enemies, or you can eat it in a heal. None of this is actually spelled out to the player at any point. Just do with it what you will. Of the 10 or so people who have played through the PowerPoint, each of them has had a completely different outcome. Kate's approach to the game was more compassionate. She avoided combat, and so her experience was more emotional and narrative focused. Whereas Julian, though he had started off speaking quite often to characters, he quickly became enamored with the combat areas and the adventure that provided. Meanwhile, Alex was a lot harsher in his words and actions, and he took a much more exploratory route to the game. He really wandered all over the place and saw as much as he could, while more or less ignoring the guided paths until he felt the need to go back to them. And so, because of their underlying psychology, all 3 of the testers experienced the act in a very different way, and it was reflected in their personality outcomes. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about what's behind the scenes for Freeride. And maybe with your help or someone else out there, we'll be able to make this game a reality sometime soon. Thank you for listening.